When we look back upon the past presidents of the United States, we often conjure up images of leaders such as Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. However, to truly understand the history of the United States, it's imperative that we acknowledge all of the country's presidents, both the most memorable and the most forgotten. In this video, I'm going to be talking about 5 presidents in particular that served in the late 19th century. 5 presidents, more specifically, that are often forgotten nowadays. The 5 presidents that I'm referring to are Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, Grover Cleveland, and Benjamin Harrison. These 5 consecutive presidents spent their time in office during the Gilded Age, an era in which the northern and western United States saw dramatic economic growth. This era largely shaped these presidents, and it's important to have an understanding of this time period in order to analyze their presidencies. The Gilded Age took place from the 1870s to about 1900, and was a time when the United States started industrializing. About a century before, Great Britain had gone through industrialization, and many other European nations, as well as the United States, wanted to quickly follow suit. Although the United States was a bit slow to reach the point that Britain had arrived at in the late 18th century, they nonetheless arrived at it, and came out of industrialization as a major global superpower. But how did the 5 presidents I mentioned earlier contribute to this rapid change in the nation? To answer that question, I'll start at the first of the 5 presidents, Rutherford B. Hayes. President Hayes won the election of 1876 after a dramatically close race in which Hayes won 185 electoral votes to his opponent, Samuel J. Tilden's 184. It was the second instance in presidential election history of a candidate winning the presidency despite losing the popular vote. Upon entering office, he immediately started working on an end to Reconstruction. This was because the Democrats had conceded the presidential race to Hayes, a Republican, only under the circumstances that President Hayes would remove federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction policies from Lincoln's administration. Hayes kept this promise and did indeed remove federal troops in an effort to unite the North and South again. Although Hayes can be respected for his work in trying to restore peace and unity, many Americans viewed this as a direct act of betrayal to the millions of African Americans that were set free under the 13th Amendment only a decade earlier. In fact, it was this decision that really started to change the Republican Party's beliefs at the time. Once a party that fought fervently for the rights of African Americans and the abolition of slavery. After Rutherford Hayes, the party started shifting its views toward different issues that it thought to be more pressing. However, that's not to say that Rutherford Hayes wasn't a supporter of equality. He was an abolitionist and even fought for the Union during the Civil War, one of 8 future presidents that participated in the nation's bloodiest conflicts. Although he was fairly bipartisan and appointed many Southern Democrats to high positions in the government at the time, he wasn't a particularly popular president. This was partly due to the fact that he was president during the Long Depression, a period in history where the country went through an economic depression after the end of the Civil War. The national government had been taking money out of circulation to try to build back the country after the war, which heavily damaged the U.S. economy and businesses. Although Hayes cannot be blamed directly for this depression, he was nonetheless fairly unpopular by the end of his presidency, and abided by his campaign promise to serve only one term. He would be succeeded by James Garfield, a former senator, Civil War veteran, and a man that had served 18 years in Congress. He beat Southern Democratic nominee General Winfield Scott Hancock comfortably in the 1880 presidential election, though only won the popular vote by a margin of about 10,000 votes. Although he was a Republican, like Hayes, his presidency was drastically different. One pressing issue that Garfield focused on upon entering the White House in 1881 was civil rights. Garfield, like many Americans at the time, felt as though Hayes had turned his back on the African Americans during his presidency, and feared that Jim Crow laws and racism in the South would prevent African Americans from being able to live decent lives. Although Reconstruction had already ended under the Hayes administration, Garfield boldly stated that the Republican Party was not done fighting for the rights of African Americans in the country, and the elevation of slaves to full citizenship is the most important political change we have known since the adoption of the Constitution in 1787. Although many in the Republican Party were already trying to distance themselves from civil rights reforms, James Garfield was intent on the idea that the government had both the means and the responsibility to achieve equality for all American citizens, regardless of race. Although he might be best known for his call for civil rights, he also advocated for agricultural technology, a better educated electorate, and dealt with the corruption of the post office department. Garfield appeared to be on track to change the path the country was heading in, but his presidency was ended short when he was shot by an Illinois native named Charles Guiteau. The assassin thought that it was a message from God for him to kill Garfield, and thought that by killing the president, the Republican Party would be united, something that further illustrates the division Garfield faced even in his own party. James Garfield died less than 200 days into his presidential term. Upon the death of James Garfield, his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, was immediately sworn in. This was the fourth time in U.S. history that a vice president became president after the death of an incumbent. Although Chester Arthur's presidency can't be categorized as catastrophic, it was a disappointment for many Americans that wished for another progressive president, like James Garfield. That's not to say that Arthur didn't get anything done, though. One of his largest accomplishments as president was the passing of the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883, which changed the way the United States government hired and fired employees. It stated that to be hired by the U.S. government, people would take competitive exams instead of simply getting an office due to political connections. This meant that government offices would be held by people with merit. It also stated that someone couldn't be fired based on political reasons. Although acts like these aren't often the highlights of United States history, President Arthur's work helped create a more transparent and trustworthy government. He also vetoed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which suspended Chinese immigration into the country for a decade. Although Congress overrode his veto, Arthur continued to advocate for the well-being of both immigrants and African Americans throughout his presidency. Chester Arthur decided not to run for re-election, however, as he was suffering from Bright's disease, a serious kidney ailment. He left office in 1884, and although he wasn't one of the more consequential presidents in U.S. history, the work he put in during his time in office helped increase bipartisanship in Washington and provide meaningful reform. Unfortunately, a lot of his beliefs surrounding the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act have been forgotten and dismissed nowadays, as presidents, namely the current president in 2020, have repeatedly appointed people to governmental positions they are thoroughly unqualified for. After President Arthur declined to run for re-election, Grover Cleveland won the election of 1884 and became the 22nd President of the United States. Before becoming president, Cleveland was a successful lawyer and governor of New York. He's also the first Democrat on this list and was considered an icon among Democrats at the time, despite having many enemies in Washington. During his presidency, he actually continued much of Chester Arthur's policies revolving around the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, despite being from a different political party. He was also very outspoken against imperialism, a concept that would prove to grow in popularity at the turn of the 20th century. Looking back at Grover Cleveland's presidency, he's a prime example of how the era he lived in shaped his presidency. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, all of these presidents were in office during the Gilded Age, a time when the United States was rapidly industrializing. This would greatly impact Cleveland's presidency and split his two presidential terms in half. You see, President Cleveland fought to have protective tariffs lowered, which frightened a lot of Americans at the time, as they feared foreign nations would control the market of the United States. In the election of 1888, Cleveland was voted out of office, due to a large voter turnout of Americans in industrial states that felt as though their jobs were threatened by lower tariffs. Naturally, the country turned to a Republican to try to reverse Cleveland's presidency, and so Benjamin Harrison was elected in 1888. Many saw Harrison as a solid senator, and a good choice for president as he championed Native Americans, homesteaders, and veterans of the Civil War. However, Harrison turned out to be a disappointment to Democrats and Republicans alike. Although he was certainly different from Cleveland and disagreed with him on almost everything, from foreign policy to the issue of protective tariffs, many felt as though he wasn't what the country needed to lead them forward. He spent much of his time trying to remove tariffs from goods such as imported raw sugars to promote sugar growers within the United States, but he was ultimately unsuccessful in dealing with the issue of protective tariffs as a whole. In the election of 1892, he was voted out of office and was replaced by none other than the 22nd President of the United States, Grover Cleveland. Cleveland's 2 non-consecutive terms as president highlight him as being truly unusual, as this was the only time in the history of the country where a president had won 2 presidential elections in non-consecutive terms. Looking back at these 5 presidents, we get a unique perspective on the Gilded Era and how these men and the Industrial Age shaped each other. All were quite different from each other, yet they played a similar role in the late 19th century. They helped lead the country after the end of Reconstruction, dealt with an industrial United States, and set the framework for the 20th century. Although each one of these men were far from perfect, it's a shame that they aren't recognized as much as other presidents in the nation's history, such as Andrew Jackson or John F. Kennedy. I think that to have a complete understanding of the progress the United States has made, we as learners need to look beyond the major wars and depressions we have faced and focus on the presidents that did a lot of the work behind the scenes. Although the late 19th century didn't see the most drastic changes in the nation, it is certainly a time period with men that should not be forgotten.